Today on This Week Health.
Medicine is hard, but there's a lot of things that we can do in the automation front to make clinician lives and patient lives easier and safer, using AI to perpetually learn and improve upon those things. That's really the most exciting part right now, is automation to improve the experience and get back to the care of medicine.
It's Newsday. My name is Bill Russell. I'm a former CIO for a 16-hospital system and creator of This Week Health, a channel dedicated to keeping health IT staff current and engaged. Special thanks to CrowdStrike, Proofpoint, ClearSense, Meditech, Cedars-Sinai Accelerator, TalkDesk, and DrFirst, who are our Newsday show sponsors for investing in our mission to develop the next generation of health leaders. All right, it's Newsday, and today we're joined by Dr. Colin Banas with DrFirst. Colin, welcome back to the show.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, last time we saw each other was at the conferences. We're not going to cover the conferences. I'll give you just a quick, what was your impression of the conferences that you went to?
I was pleasantly surprised that the turnout was as good as it was at both Vive and HIMSS. I was worried, and HIMSS did not disappoint.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. I mean, if you combine the two conferences, there was over 30,000 people at the two conferences. So given that we aren't officially outside the pandemic, those numbers are really promising. And it looks like both conferences have enough to build on going into next year. So we will see how that goes. I wanted to start with something with you. I'm getting ready. My daughter's going to graduate from college. And one of my favorite things is to pull up commencement speeches and that kind of stuff. But I'm curious for you, you've had a bunch of commencement addresses, right? You've graduated a couple of times. Do you remember any of the speeches from those commencement addresses?
No. I do remember one speech where a gentleman used an anecdote that I had heard before. And I said, well, that's clever, but it's not original. But yeah, in preparation for this, I couldn't remember any of them.
Yeah. We had a major coup. Our economics department got one of the Federal Reserve chairmen to come in and speak at our graduation, and it was quite the coup. And there's a picture of my entire family sleeping in the back during my commencement during his address, and I'm not sure I stayed awake either. I just wasn't sitting next to them, so it was.
Yeah. I think the key is to keep them short and to keep them humorous. I think some of the most successful commencement speeches are not any more than 5 minutes max, and sprinkle in some humor.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Any idea what you would talk about if I asked you to speak at a commencement address?
I'd like to think that I'd be, funny and witty, and probably put some thought into that. But I think it's an offshoot of a question I get a lot about my career path, and it's kind of non-conventional, at least it was at the time, to get where I am now. And the advice I give the residents and the interns who are asking me about careers, it's usually along the lines of never stop learning, which is, of course, a common theme for a lot of these commencement speeches, but really is true. I just kept getting more and more degrees, education, just kept open to it. And then the second thing is get involved. I would not have landed where I am now without getting involved in some really non-conventional committees or projects at the health system level. And it's just funny how organic relationships and career paths evolve simply from just being involved. Those are probably the two biggies.
Yeah, if I were doing an address, it would probably be the failures that have shaped me. And I would just go through my failures over time. And if I did it correct, what they would walk away from this is you're going to screw up a lot in your life. And it's really how you deal with those things and how you move forward that make you who you are when you get to the end of your life and go, yeah, that was a life well lived, as opposed to, I wish I wouldn't have feared failure so much that I avoided doing the things that I wanted to do. All right. Yeah, I sort of feel like Matthew McConaughey here, throwing out little pearls of wisdom. Did you read his book?
No, I've heard him give interviews on it, and it sounds like a great read.
He's quite the philosopher. My wife and I had a long drive. We went from Pennsylvania to Florida, and we decided, all right, what book are we going to read that's going to keep us awake? And it did not disappoint. We stayed awake the whole time. He's a great storyteller. It was just a lot of fun to listen to. All right, first story for us. And this is an interesting one. Preparing clinicians for a clinical world influenced by artificial intelligence. And this is in jamnetwork.com. And it's an article that's out there, preparing clinicians for a clinical world influenced by artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, AI and ML, machine learning, are poised to transform the way healthcare is delivered. AI is the use of computers to simulate intelligence. ML is essentially how we train those computers for AI algorithms. While AI has been critiqued as being in its hype cycle, that's an understatement. Over time, it is likely that every medical specialty will be influenced by AI and some will be transformed. I don't know about you. Did you run across some interesting AI or ML solutions while you were at the conferences?
I think you're spot on in that hype cycle comment. I think actually clinicians or potential partners are becoming numb to the term AI. And I think you've heard me say this before. I really hate artificial intelligence. I'd rather say something like augmented or advanced intelligence. The other thing is, and again, I'm going to repeat myself from prior talks, but I think there's tremendous opportunity for AI to do some of the smaller things in automation. And I've often referred to this as hitting a single instead of trying to use AI to hit a grand slam. So the Watson experience, we were going to cure cancer with AI, and we got a lot out of it and a lot of learning, but medicine is hard. But there's a lot of things that we can do in the automation front to make clinician lives and patient lives easier and safer, using AI to perpetually learn and improve upon those things. I think that's really the most exciting part right now, is automation to improve the experience and get back to the care of medicine.
Yeah, and I think I saw some of each of those at the conference. I saw one solution that was AI on top of mammography imaging, and it was, again, assisted, just like you said, pointing out some things that the clinician might want to, whoever's doing the reads might want to take a look at. And it improved the speed of those reads by 55%. And also just the overall effectiveness of the reads in terms of error rates and those kind of things went way down. The other is obviously with voice and pulling in the voice and creating the note and that kind of stuff. All that stuff's really interesting and lends itself to that automation aspect that you're talking about, taking the mundane work out of the clinician's hands and letting them practice medicine, and the technology sort of comes around them and helps to support them in the practice of medicine. The JAMA article goes on to talk about really five things that they think would help. And one of them is they do say, don't ignore AI. The fact is that AI is here. It's starting to contribute. It's starting to show up in different places. Their first statement, though, is welcome skepticism, avoid cynicism. Like, AI doesn't exist, you can't define it, those kinds of things. Instead, welcome it with skepticism. We should be asking questions about the algorithms. How is it making decisions? How is it determining what's coming in front of us as the clinicians, or in front of you as a clinician? I am not a clinician, but what we are putting in front of the clinicians, welcome the skepticism, because it is a computer. The algorithms could be wrong. It could be misreading the information, and we can make them better over time. But avoid cynicism on the topic, because we will likely see it really expand in its use. What are you hearing from clinicians, or what are your thoughts on the adoption of AI in the clinical world?
Well, I think the cynicism comment is, I think it is easy to become cynical about AI given some big ticket.
Yep.
Yeah. So sepsis prediction in some major EMR and having to walk that back. I mentioned the Watson experience. I do think skepticism is a better adjective for it. I think trust but verify is kind of a credo for the clinical world. And all of this and what you brought up really opens the topic of governance.
Right.
How are we going to govern, regulate AI? How do we know what went into the algorithm? How are we going to update the algorithm based on changes in medicine, changes in populations, et cetera? And so there really needs to be a certain amount of transparency in these AI engines so that folks can understand where the outcomes or where the suggestions and decision support are coming from. And I think that's the tougher part. The article actually also mentioned, it's a corollary to something that's a little bit over almost 2 decades now. The big, when I was training, the big movement was evidence-based medicine. How are we going to put evidence into our care sets, into our decision support, et cetera? And you had to show the clinicians where did the evidence come from in order for them to buy in and to trust it. So take that forward into the AI realm, and it's the same thing.
Yep. Yeah, the transparency and trust, clinical appraisal guidelines, and clinicians and patients shared decision making. I think it's interesting that transparency. John Hallam came on, talked about along the lines of a label on AI that says, here's what's in it, here's what's coming, here's where this data is coming from, here's what the algorithms are doing. The other thing, we talked to a bunch of CIOs and data scientists at the conferences, and they kept talking about drift, and they kept talking about the challenges with the data sets, and we have to be cognizant of that. This is where bias comes in. This is where we might be looking at a data set that's not representative of the data set we're trying to care for in our community. If we are trying to take a national data set or even a statewide data set, may not be indicative of the people who are coming into your ED from 8 o'clock at night to 7 o'clock in the morning. We have to really fine tune those algorithms to the populations that we're trying to serve.
Absolutely.
We'll get to our show in just a minute. As you've probably heard, we've launched a new show, Town Hall, on our community channel, This Week Health Community, and it airs on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'll be taking a back seat to some of these people who are on the front lines. Town Hall is hosted by an array of talented healthcare leaders who are facing today's challenges head on. We're going to hear from professionals and their networks on hot button issues, technical deep dives, and the tactical challenges that healthcare faces. We have some great hosts on this. We have Charles Boise and Angelique Russell, data scientists, Craig Richardville, Lee Milligan, Reed Steffen, who are all CIOs. We have Jake Lancaster and Brett Oliver, who are CMIOs, and Matt Sickles, a cybersecurity first responder. I'd love to have you listen to these episodes. You can subscribe on our community channel, This Week Health Community, wherever you find and listen to podcasts. Now, let's get to the show. One of the things I want to talk about a fair amount, because it was the number one issue that I heard at the conference, which was labor and staffing, right? So staffing on the clinical side, staffing on the administrative side, every area of staffing, from the custodial to the physicians to IT staff and whatnot is a challenge. And I saw this story in the USA Today. We don't often talk about the USA Today on this show, but it talked about this concept of Boomerang Employees. And what they're talking about is employers are seeking out former workers, and they're trying to tap into them. And in some cases, these could be retirees. In other cases, it can be people that have specialized skills that have potentially moved on to other employers, and they're going back after them. Former employers might be thinking differently about a hole in their resume in a tight job market, so they're looking at that group. And then the other thing they say here is, when it comes to compensation and benefits, there are questions for both parties to consider, in that the calculus has sort of changed. When you have a challenging labor market, employers have identified an area that they can't fill. A former employee would fill that well. And sometimes they're thinking different about the compensation. They're thinking different about the work environment. So they can essentially say, don't come into the office is now a pretty common thing to say. And they can work from their retirement location, provide some to fill in. It could be 3 days a week, could be all Zoom based and whatnot. What are you hearing out there with regard to staffing levels and finding good talent in your circles?
Yeah, I think what the common theme of what you were just mentioning is having to get very creative to recruit and also to retain talent. That term boomerang employees, I've been with DrFirst for 3 years now. I've come across at least 3 or 4 employees who have come and gone and come back like a boomerang. And I think you're spot on in terms of where folks are in their career trajectory and what they want, and the fact that the employer is having to offer so much more latitude in order to fill the need. That is one of the great accelerators that came out of the pandemic, is this flexibility, this movement towards remote. And the last time we talked, I actually mentioned I'm not a fan of it. I recognize its importance, but I still miss the in-person part of it. But the other thing on the clinical side from my colleagues, and you mentioned on the clinical front especially, very hard times getting and retaining clinical talent. Massive signing bonuses aren't even cutting it anymore. And so that's, to link the two articles together, that's where something like AI or at least automation can come in to at least give you that force multiplier for the existing staff that you have. But it is a tough market out there.
Yeah, so we are going to see technology be called upon to step into some of these gaps. It will be interesting to see where it can play. I may have mentioned this to you before. I saw a cartoon where the nurse was sitting across from whoever the hiring person was, and they were saying, look, we're not going to be able to give you a pay increase. You should go somewhere else. The next screen, obviously, is that nurse going to a traveling nurse company, and she gets hired. And then she goes back to the original employer, and they end up paying her twice as much to be a traveling nurse at the same location. And it's one of those things that you read and you sort of scratch your head, and then you talk to people and they go, no, that's actually happening.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's sad.
It's kind of crazy. But I think what happens in the longer, we're going to talk about innovation. In fact, we can go next to the what kills innovation conversation, because one of the things we're hearing is tight budgets. One of the things that's creating tight budgets at these health systems right now is this wage inflation, I guess is what we're calling it. But essentially it's, we have to retain talent, so we're paying them more. We have to find talent, so we're filling gaps with temporary workers, which is costing more. And the work really hasn't subsided. There's still the same amount of work to get done. And so there's wages we're seeing on the bottom. It'll be interesting to see when we actually get the numbers. A lot of this is anecdotal, but we're seeing almost a 10-20% increase in wages at some health systems. That's a serious bump to the highest cost of running a hospital.
Yeah, one of the things, and correct me where I'm wrong on this, but I remember you telling a story once back in your CIO days where you very much encouraged innovation on all fronts. A lot of that was in the form of automation, whether it was virtual servers or whatnot. And the idea was, what can you guys innovate around to get some of this spend down? And I love that story because what it told me is that you were very early on had instilled a culture of innovation for the health system, and that it paid off. And I think in that article, what kills innovation, lack of commitment to innovation. The most progressive health systems, no matter how dire it is, are still making that commitment on some front to innovate.
Yeah, there's some interesting things here. You have Christine Bricata, who's been a guest of the show from Common Spirit Health. Health systems are just recovering from the COVID surge. There's a lot of concern about staffing levels and financials, which has hindered innovation as the health systems have been focused on immediate issues rather than future investments in innovation. And what's interesting about that, and I know exactly where she's coming from, because it's tyranny of the urgent. What's in front of you, what needs to be solved. But the problem is, if you stay there, you will always be there. If you don't at least look out 1 year ahead, if not 2 or 3 years ahead, there's no way to break out of that until you start to look 1 or 2 years out and say, okay, how are we going to do this a little differently? But I know a lot of health systems are really focused right now on how do we solve these immediate problems that are in front of us. And if you take a short-term view, and we've seen this cycle over and over again, but it's, well, our number one cost is staffing, therefore we have to reduce our staffing to get our costs in line. And you just create this really vicious cycle instead of being creative and innovative in terms of how you come out of that?
I think it's spot on. It's no different when I was doing my CMIO role. We got so laser focused on things like meaningful use or the Joint Commission or whatever the crisis du jour was. And they never stopped. So it just kept coming. And so
There's always another crisis. Is that?
Yeah,
there absolutely is.
You never let the crisis go to waste, but at the same time, we absolutely lost our way in terms of innovation. And that's where I like to say that those things sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the room, because early on, I really did have the latitude to innovate. And I think from a personal perspective, that was the most fulfilling in my CMIO role, was the innovation.
Kalela Eskandanian, Vice President and Chief Information Officer, Children's National Hospital in DC. What kills innovation is inaction and not leveraging the pandemic lessons to continue developing novel solutions. It's interesting, that crisis, the pandemic as a crisis, catapulted innovation because it changed the environment we were operating in, and we had to think differently. We had to say, all right, there's no status quo here. We haven't addressed anything like this in our history. And so a lot of really smart people went into rooms and said, all right, how are we going to do this? And what I think you hear this chief innovation officer calling for is, let's keep that creativity going. And that's hard to do. It's hard to create that burning platform that people are constantly looking at it going, all right, we've got to change this. We've got to continue to innovate on top of this.
Yeah. One of the things I think from my colleagues, it really broke through a lot of the friction and barriers related to governance. You were able to shorten the cycle for decision-making out of necessity around technology implementations and innovation. So if that's one of the lessons that we could preserve going forward, is more rapid cycle iteration and reduced bureaucracy of governance that is sometimes pervasive in larger health systems.
I'll hit on these last. These are actually all really good points. Brad Shank, Administrative Director in Innovation at Houston Methodist. There's too much concern over failure. When I hear that, it's interesting. I understand what they're saying, fail fast and whatnot. But I also remember my CEO coming to me saying, hey, you've got to watch what your words you're using. This is healthcare. And I know you want to move faster. I know you want to fail fast, but failure cannot mean causing harm. Failure cannot mean all these things. And she goes, so sometimes she goes, I understand completely the verbiage you're using, but the Silicon Valley verbiage doesn't always translate real well when we come into healthcare.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I had a CEO, similarly, he was actually very supportive of innovation. And he would say things like, if you throw 10 things against the wall and one of them sticks, that's still worth the investment to me. Obviously, you can deconstruct that a little bit, but at least there was a culture of innovation that he was instilling. I do think you're spot on, though. You're not allowed to introduce harm in any way in the cycle. That is verboten.
Yeah, and there's a lot of ways to minimize it. And we did certain pilots. We did information alongside other information, so the physician could continue to practice the way they were, and then they saw this other information and they could mark it and say, hey, your algorithm was spot on, or your algorithm is not giving us stuff that is going to be helpful here or whatever. And so we would innovate in a parallel track so that.
Yeah, that is spot on. And this was a constant tension between me and IT. Is they called it tantamount to testing in prod, which it really wasn't. It was more of a parallel process. But that's where your informaticists come in, who are fully aware of, can we make changes for this select population of users? And can we get real world feedback on real patients as to what we've changed and how it affected the experience and the outcome? I think that is super important. And the fact that you were able to do that is huge.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't step one, but that was, when we were getting close to implementation, that's what it looked like, because we needed that real world background. We also needed the clinician feedback, and we tried to minimize the impact on their workload and still get the feedback. And so we made it real simple, like little one-click buttons, spot on, missed the mark. I mean, it was as simple as it could be, because You can't see 12 patients in an hour and then also be doing IT work, on the side. So Scott Jocelyn, who's also been on the show, friend, because he was a CIO in a neighboring hospital down in Orange County, says what will kill innovation is an organization within an organization is lack of commitment, disproportionate funding, and not placing the right people in the right place. And that really gets back to what you were saying. I mean, if the culture supports it, it will likely happen. If the culture does not support it, they're not going to fund it. They're not going to allow people the time to innovate and give them the freedom to innovate. That's likely going to be the thing that kills it off the quickest, I think.
Yep.
I want to go back to an article. I shot this over to you because I want to get your comments. Two non-clinicians last week talked about CMIO 3.0. And so I have some comments on last week's Newsday show on CMIO 3.0. But since you are a CMIO and have practiced as a CMIO, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this article on the 3.0 iteration of the CMIO's role.
Yeah. And we might even be up to 4.0, depending on how you slice this up. But the traditional model, and I can't claim credit for this. This is a lot of my colleagues follow this. My CMIO 1.0 was the MD who was good at IT and therefore got tapped to help with the EHR or the EHR implementation. 2.0 was, holy cow, we have this thing, but it's not at all tweaked, modified, optimized. And then 3.0, at least the way I used to frame it in my mind, was data. How can I leverage the data that I'm getting out of this new EMR flow in order to really manage and make decisions at a population level, and also implement evidence-based interventions directly into EHR workflows? I think if you wanted to go a step further and say there's a fourth iteration, it's around experience. I think either patient experience, digital front door, whatever you want to call that, there's a piece of that now that is falling in some version of CMIO. And then also innovation, as we've been talking about a lot today.
Yeah. In the article, they say 3.0 is, so 1.0 is EHR implementation, 2.0 is optimization and making it work for us. 3.0, they talked about, and I think I agree with you. I think it's more 4.0 because data really makes sense as 3.0. 4.0 is this new set of tools that's coming down the pike and leading those efforts to bring AI and ML into the environment safely with governance and really leading up that charge. I think that's the CMIO. That would make sense for the CMIO to do that, wouldn't it?
It would, but I'll go back to you can't manage what you can't measure. The 3.0 in my mind being that analytics or enterprise data warehouse.
Yeah,
I think you can't overstate that. And I don't think you want to squish that into innovation in AI. I think you have to have that firm foundation before you go down the path of experience AI and ML.
Yeah, absolutely. The CMIO role really has changed. I mean, it used to be an adjunct in the IT organization to help with the EHR implementation. I know when we did our EHR implementation, the CMIO he didn't report to me and had a staff of, oh my gosh, again, this is a $7 billion health system, but I think he had a staff of about 60 people, 65 people helping with all that stuff. That didn't include contractors for the EHR implementation, but that 60 was like the ongoing. And by the way, IT still had all the EHR staff over here to keep it running and optimized and those kinds of things. The reporting and whatnot fell under IT. So again, these are two significant organizations now, whereas it used to be, hey, we got this doc who really knows technology. Let's see what he can do. Now it's like, no. This is a seasoned role that will likely have accreditation attached to it, who is a leader within the organization, a change agent, a change leader, as well as somebody who can lead a staff effectively.
Yeah, it's leadership, it's change agent. And then the third thing I put in the job description is translator. So it's effective translation between clinical needs and nerd speak. being able to go back to the analyst and say, I didn't need my informaticist to be able to code. I certainly couldn't code in CCL, Cerner Command Language, anything like that. But I could speak it, and I knew the limitations of the system and what was and wasn't possible. So I think those are the three biggies in terms of what you look for in a seasoned CMIO.
Fantastic. Colin, always great to catch up with you. Thanks for the time today. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Love being here.
What a great discussion. If you know of someone that might benefit from our channel from these kinds of discussions, please forward them a note, perhaps your team, your staff. I know if I were a CIO today, I would have every one of my team members listening to a show just like this one. It's conference level value every week. They can subscribe on our website, thisweekhealth.com. They can also subscribe wherever they listen to podcasts, Apple, Google, Overcast. You get the picture. We are everywhere. Go ahead, subscribe today. We want to thank our Newsday sponsors who are investing in our mission to develop the next generation of health leaders. Those are CrowdStrike, Proofpoint, ClearSense, Meditech, Cedars-Sinai Accelerator, TalkDesk, and DrFirst. Thanks for listening. That's all for now.